Hi there. Welcome to the Imperfect Prophet podcast for women who wonder. Frankly, as we go through life, I'm sure we wonder about a great deal. First as little kids, then as adolescents, then as young women, then as transitional women. What are we calling ourselves these days? And then you get to this point in life, or my point in life, when you're postmenopausal and wondering what's next. Wondering if the parade already passed you by. Join me, Wonder Wendy. I'm going to be your host as we talk about some of these unique challenges that face women today in a new millennium, going through menopause and trying to live a rich, full life. There might even be a few men and younger women that want to listen in too. That's okay. But there's a roller coaster and we're all on it. And I'm going to be your guide to help you figure out when you should close your eyes, when you should hang on, and maybe we'll explore some ideas for what works for you if it doesn't work for me, or vice versa. So join the conversation, pick up your favorite beverage, and we'll talk to you soon. Welcome to the Imperfect Prophet.
Good day to you all. Here I am in another new location. This time we're in a lounge off a breakfast room in a Westin hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina. All the adventures. The kitchen is directly across the hall, so if you hear clinks and clanks and a little bit of conversation, it's probably our lovely servers. They've been fabulous here. Shout out to Morgan at the Westin. She has been treating me beautifully. Which brings me to today's episode. Sorry, you're probably in this episode, but I said good things about Morgan, so I know she's fine. Now, before any of my friends or family start texting me, let me assure you that I do my best to protect the innocent and the guilty. Occasionally. I'm kidding. Well, not really. As we get closer to the 100th episode of The Imperfect Prophet, I find myself reflecting on all the stories that I've shared with you. For nearly 2 years, we've been meeting weekly, turning ordinary moments into lessons. Funerals, furniture, dust bunnies, blanket forts, baseball games, chance encounters, old photographs, grandchildren, and the beautiful, messy moments that make life what it is. And as I look back over nearly 100 episodes, I found myself asking an uncomfortable question. Do I owe the people in my life an apology? Raise your glass to that one. Because the people around me have inspired so many of these episodes, from chance encounters to long conversations with friends. Because every time someone says something that piques my curiosity, well, it puts everything in a different context. And it simply makes me stop and think. And trust me, that happens with alarming frequency. I find myself learning a lesson, mulling over a question that I have to explore, whether they intended it to be a lesson or not, whether they intended to teach me or not. And before I know it, it ends up here. Not necessarily in Charlotte, but on a podcast, which now that I say that out loud may explain why my friends have started interrupting conversations to announce, "Ooh, that's a podcast," sometimes before I figured it out myself. This isn't a new question for me about where's the boundary line. In fact, as I was thinking about storytellers, I remember watching Kathie Lee Gifford years ago when her children were young, and she was co-hosting a wildly popular morning television show with Regis Philbin. And millions of us started our day listening to them talk about their lives. That's really how they started every single episode. And Kathie Lee often talked about her family, her children, her husband, the funny things, the ordinary things. And yes, if memory serves, occasionally things like one of the kids pooping in the bathtub. At least that's how I remember it. Which I must admit makes me wonder if her now grown son has ever looked back and thought, "Mom, really?" And while apparently we were all riveted by their conversation, I do remember occasionally wondering, do her kids ever wish if she would keep some of those stories to herself? Now, as a younger woman, I wasn't entirely sure where that line was. And now, nearly 100 podcast episodes later, I find myself revisiting the same question. Not about Kathy Lee, but about yours truly. Have I shared, well, too much? Have I borrowed too freely from the people around me? Have I used you for material? Have I turned ordinary conversations into content simply because I could? It is a question worth asking, especially for anyone whose work involves telling stories. But the more I sat with that question, the more I realized I was looking at it backwards. Have you ever wondered where podcast episodes come from? Not technically, not the microphone or editing software. If you've messaged me to ask about starting a podcast, don't get too excited. This isn't that episode. I'm not going to get into the technical which mic, which camera, and how to find lighting and a space in a noisy, crowded hotel. This is not that episode. I'm talking about where the inspiration, the ideas come from. The truth is the people in my life keep ending up in the stories, not by name, of course. If I do, I ask for permission, except for Morgan, who was serving me my breakfast this morning. Sorry, Morgan. But still, if you've been listening for a while, some of these moments may sound familiar because you've heard so many of them before. A conversation over coffee becomes insight. Maybe it was that friend who casually said, "You should teach other women that life can expand after 50. After all, that's what started this whole podcast journey 2-3 years ago now. A family gathering becomes a lesson. And if you've been with me for a while, you may remember last December's episode about holiday traditions, family gatherings, and other hostage situations. Maybe the topic is a long overdue conversation about forgiveness. The kind that requires both giving and receiving it. How about when you're sitting at a table and everyone's gripping their coffee cups just a little bit tighter as the conversation unfolds across the table? The difficult goodbye that becomes an episode about laughter and tears. And before I knew it, something that happened in ordinary life has somehow found its way into my next divine download. So let's go back to the initial question. Am I stealing material, using your lives? How about this soundtrack? Strumming my pain with his fingers, killing me softly with his song. Well, maybe I'm looking at this all wrong. Maybe I'm receiving gifts from each and every one of you. I realize that every storyteller eventually has to face the uncomfortable truth that the people we love become part of the stories we tell. Because life happens in relationship, not in isolation. A solo walk may help you hear your own thoughts, and I enjoy those too. But it is often other people who help us hear something entirely new. The comment that changes our perspective, the question that won't leave us alone, the observation that suddenly reframes everything. It isn't always new information. It can simply be a different voice, a different perspective, a different emphasis. Years ago, I heard the great actor Charlton Heston read Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. I had heard that poem so many times. Growing up in the Northeast, Robert Frost, poet laureate. And somewhere along the way, I'd gotten lost in the rhythm of the poem. Whose woods are these? I think I know. His house is in the village, though. But Heston, he approached it differently, and the pentameter was still there. but he simply refused to let the rhythm govern the meaning. Whose woods are these? I think I know. His house is in the village, though. Same words, same poem, completely different understanding. And I realized something. We can honor the basic architecture and still see things differently. Wisdom doesn't always come from demolition. Sometimes it comes from changing the way we see and hear. It doesn't have to be something new. It can be just because someone helps us hear the familiar differently. I don't know about you, but I've learned from parents and children, spouses and ex-spouses. Trust me, there are a few folders in that latter category that are not yet ready for public consumption, and certainly some my husband would rather I do not share. And perhaps they will never be ready for public consumption. Need to unpack that one later. I share what I learn, and I try not to reveal truths that belong to someone else, even the exes, even the people who hurt me. Their story is still theirs to tell. I may talk about my experience in that situation and what I learned while walking that mile. That's my side of the equation. But some details, well, they belong to another heart. And that's an important distinction. I don't own those. So if you ever recognize yourself in one of these stories, I hope you know that my intention is to honor the relationship, whether or not you are actually the person I am talking about. I learned from all of you, friends, family, people I've loved, and complete strangers who cross my path at exactly the right moment. And when we're paying attention, those moments can happen frequently, and they are definitely gifts. So while every episode starts with a story, it never ends there. If it's just a good story, it is a good story, but the lesson is always something deeper. And if it changes the way I see the world, well, that's usually a podcast episode. It's never really about the event that started it all. It's about the truth hiding inside the event. And the people in my life keep handing me those truths without even realizing it. And like I said, they aren't giving me material. They're giving me perspective, because nothing viewed from only one direction is ever fully seen. Do you remember when we talked about mannequins in the store in a long ago episode? You know, on every mannequin, the clothes seem to fit perfectly. Well, I remember telling you, walk around to that back of that mannequin and discover the truth. Because when you see that they are pinned into place to make them look better, to make them fit better, it's the same mannequin. It's just a different perspective. And suddenly everything changes. That's what you keep giving me. The questions, the new perspective, a different way of seeing the world. And I want to pass that back to you and reframe it. When I first started this podcast journey, I was more likely to build an episode around a quote from a famous person. Okay, I just quoted Charlton Heston, but whatever. Or a metaphor I stumbled across in the world. You know, the wobbly cafe table a year ago, a story from a book, a line from someone wiser than me. And there are so many people who are wiser than me. And everyone who knows something I don't. And almost every one of you knows at least one thing I don't. And there's nothing wrong with that. But somewhere over the last year, something shifted. I started paying closer attention to what was happening right in front of me. The conversations around my own dinner table. The questions my friends were asking. Oh, the stories hidden inside ordinary days. The moments that initially seemed small, but refused to leave me alone, like the tiniest pebble in your shoe. Something you wouldn't think could possibly matter, and yet once it's there, it's impossible to ignore. Those are the moments that become episodes. Like I said, a funeral can become a lesson about grief and letting go. Last week, it was my grandson kneeling on a couch that became a lesson about legacy and inherited rules. A friend's question became an invitation to deeper self-discovery. This episode is never really about the event or the episode, any episode. And I've come to realize that many of the people in my life have been quietly handing me those truths all along. And I just wasn't looking until recently, which makes me wonder how many truths are quietly waiting in plain sight for all of us. Maybe they're hidden in a conversation, a photograph, a disappointment, a chance encounter, a reunion, a text message. I'm not sure I've discovered anything extraordinary. I'm just paying attention and then sharing what I find. After all, I'm walking this journey right alongside you, sharing what I've learned, not always getting it right, still learning, still wondering, and grateful that we get to do it together. Well, how meaning gets made. You know, most people experience hundreds of meaningful moments every year, if not every month or every day, every hour. The difference isn't that some people have extraordinary lives. Although, to be fair, I did once create an episode from a chance encounter with Henry Winkler, and I realize that doesn't happen to everybody. But most of the moments that shape us aren't celebrity encounters. They're conversations, questions, observations, unexpected moments that ask us to pay attention. The difference is that some people have developed the habit of asking, what was that trying to teach me? And if you haven't developed that habit yet, I encourage you to try it. You know, when a stranger says something that stays with you, whether it's inspiring or irritating, so many examples of both. Let's just keep it simple, like that pebble in your shoe. It's a sign. I don't think I've become any wiser with age. I think I've actually become more curious. I've become more willing to sit with a moment just a little longer, to ask a second question instead of accepting the first answer. I always wonder why something has affected me and look for the gift hiding inside that moment. Now, I've said the word gift a lot in this episode, and that's because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that's exactly what these moments are. Gifts. You share them with me and I share them with the world. There is something beautiful about that. And there's a kind of generosity that keeps moving from one person to another. I think the Greeks called it agape. Love expressed as a gift freely given. Which brings me back to the people who unknowingly populate this podcast. Some of you know who you are, like the 78-year-old usher at the Diamondbacks game I talked about just a few weeks ago. By the way, she posted an enthusiastic thank you after listening. Some of you recognize yourselves immediately, and some of you listened and happily thought, ooh, wait a minute, is that me? And every once in a while, someone has listened and has been absolutely certain I was talking about them when I wasn't, which taught me another lesson. We all tend to find ourselves in stories, whether we belong there or not. Maybe that's because we're always looking for meaning. We're constantly asking, is this about me? What does this say about me? What am I supposed to learn from this? Stories are mirrors that way. What am I supposed to learn? And sometimes we see ourselves accurately. other times we don't. We are often victims of our own self-vision. But if we're lucky, we discover something we haven't seen before. You've been seeing things through the lens of your experience, your fears, your assumptions, your unfinished business. This is one of the reasons stories matter in the first place. But for those of you who are actually in the stories, thank you. You haven't just helped to shape an episode. See how excited I am? You haven't just helped to shape an episode. You helped shape me. I appreciate that. So let's think about it. Every one of us is living inside someone else's story. We just may not see their side of it. We leave fingerprints on people we may never fully understand how we did it or what we left. And that can be through a difficult conversation, a lesson, a moment of grace, or something as simple as a kind word. Yesterday, I was in the airport and I noticed an airline representative. She wasn't in uniform, and she wasn't what the fashion magazines would call a fashion plate, but her wardrobe and styling were absolutely perfect for her body and her personality. She looked wonderful. So I wandered over and I told her. And the smile that came across her face told me I had done the right thing, which made me wonder, how often do we teach one another without even really realizing it? How often do we leave fingerprints we never get to see? Because the truth is, whether we realize it or not, our lives are always teaching something. What would you do if you knew your life was teaching someone something? What would you want that lesson to be? Start thinking that way. So no, I don't think I actually owe my friends and family an apology. I think I owe them gratitude, because every episode begins with a story, and every story begins with a person. And nearly 100 episodes later, I've come to realize that this podcast was never built by one woman sitting behind a microphone. It was built in conversations, in friendships, in chance encounters, in moments of heartbreak and laughter, in lessons given and lessons received, and by countless people who changed the way I see the world without ever realizing they had done so. In closing, I'd like to say two things to the people who have unknowingly inspired nearly, not quite there yet, 100 episodes of this podcast. First, I'm sorry. Second, thank you. And if you've ever listened to this podcast and wondered, wait a minute, is she talking about me? The answer is maybe. And if you are, thank you for the gift. And if you're not, thank you anyway, because chances are you will be. I'm Wonder Wendy, and until next time, stay curious, stay open to wonder, keep looking for the truth hiding inside the moment. Stay hydrated. Stay healthy. We'll talk again next week when I'll be back in Arizona. And as always, if this episode made you think of someone, don't just send them the link. Reach out. Reconnect. Tell them what they mean to you and why this episode made you think of them. Because they may have been giving you gifts all along, and maybe they deserve a thank you too, or an apology, or maybe just the gift of hearing from you. Talk to you soon.
Like what you heard here today? Then we should be friends. I suggest you join my Facebook group. It's a good way to connect. We can have a conversation, ask me questions, whatever you want to do. It is called the Wonderful Bucket List Life. That's Wonder-Full Bucket List Life. Be a bucket lister and join me on this adventure. Or you can go to my webpage, which is Wonder Wendy and Friends, join the mailing list, learn about the book I wrote, adventures that are coming up in the future, and other podcasts. I look forward to talking to you soon, and stay hydrated. Have a great day.